music always gets me so pumped. So welcome everyone to another React Wednesdays. My name is TJ VanToll. I work as a developer advocate for Progress. And we've got a really awesome crew here today to talk about open source and open source at bigger companies. So with me, let's start. We got Dan, why don't you kick things off? Dan Wilson, why don't you kick things off?
Hey, I'm Dan Wilson. I work at Digital Primates, and we do enterprise React stuff. Also, we curate the Enterprise React newsletter. So if you're down with React and you want your news delivered to your inbox twice a month, let me know. Just Google Enterprise React newsletter.
And Tanner Linsley, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tanner Linsley. I'm who am I? What am I doing here? I've been developing for like a little over 10 years. I co-founded a company called Nozzle, and we do enterprise rank tracking for some really awesome companies and SEO nerds out there. I started doing open source with libraries like Chart.js, Crossfilter, React Static. And now, most recently, I've been running the TAN stack and basically any library that starts with React dash. So React Table, React Query, React Charts, you name it. That's where I've been these days.
Awesome. We're also joined by Ray Camden.
Hey, I am a developer advocate for Here Technologies. We do location stuff, so we have mapping and geocoding and routing APIs, stuff like that. I don't do React, so thank you all. I will see you all later.
Yeah, where's the button to kick you?
I've done open source off and on for about 20 or so years. In the old days in the Cold Fusion community, and now more JavaScript and Vue.js.
Yeah, it should be fun because we've got people coming from different sort of open source backgrounds here, which I think should be interesting. And so our last guest, Dan Skaggs, joining us again this week. So Dan, you want to tell people about yourself, and maybe you could also introduce some of the work you've done in open source to sort of kick us off, lay the groundwork today.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. Appreciate you having me on. My name is Dan Skaggs, and I am an engineering manager at what I can only describe as a large multinational media company at this point, for legal reasons. So I was charged a few years ago with setting up a new kind of way of engineering doing business in our group, and I work in the what's termed within our company as the content supply chain arena, and so. Lots of apps, and we'll get into this more in a bit, but lots of apps, lots of teams, lots of things going on. And we found that there was a lot of inefficiencies in the way that we were working. So we took some pages out of the playbooks of some large open source projects and how our developers interact with one another and how our tooling is set up and things. And, it worked out very well for us. And I'll put the big caveat, the it depends programmer language. It may not work for every organization, but I'm going to talk about what worked for us and the benefits and maybe some of the downsides to it if we get that far.
I would challenge the audience to sort of pick and choose the parts of this that do work, because it'd be tough to think of the company where you could discard these ideas wholesale. There's something here that you can take with you.
And before we move too much further on, to echo Ray, I'm an Angular guy by trade, so I'm not a React person either. So I think
grab the shepherd's hook, get them out of here.
Yes, this is about to get too less, right?
I think though I think the reason it's interesting is because I've done jQuery, I've done Backbone, I've done Angular, I've done React, and a lot of these principles hold true regardless. I think in this case, like when we talk about just open source and scaling teams and such, the specific technology, actually, I think I'd almost argue doesn't matter a whole lot, just because the principles are kind of the same. And so to maybe kick this off, I know one of the things we talked about before is something called the inner source philosophy, which is a term that I had never heard before. So I'm wondering if you could just explain what that is.
Yeah, at its simplest, it is your organization within your firewall and your private development organization is essentially running it as if you were a public large open source project. It's just you're not open to the public, right? You, like with our repos, you have to be company account, and you have to be provisioned to be able to get into the source code, all that stuff. But once you're in there as a developer on one of the teams, how we go about our developer flow for getting even branching and merging and PR reviews and all of that stuff that as developers, when you're building new features or fixing bugs, just kind of that process and taking cues from those successful open source projects that deal with hundreds and sometimes thousands of engineers around the world and are able to make that work, and distilling that down in order to make your engineering group run smoother, help your engineers grow, put out better code, etc. All the benefits that we espouse from being able to collaborate with other engineers.
One thing I thought of is that I've been a part of many developer teams, and usually whatever processes are in place are the result of some kind of patchwork agreements over time. Have you noticed that it's simpler to provide processes that have a broader basis in open source internally and get buy-in?
It is, because you have examples that you can point to that says, hey, this works for people at a scale even way larger than us and way more distributed. Even though I manage teams that are distributed across the globe, and there are other teams that I don't directly manage in various places. As large as we are, there's always a bigger fish, right? So having those examples of, we do it this way, and here's why, and here's what you can look at, these projects that are being successful using this, it really helps. And I will say I was fortunate to be able to stand up a new organization and an empty directory for our monorepo, which we'll talk about a little while later. I realize, not everybody and maybe very few people can get by with that, but I still think there's things from this that you can weave into your own engineering practices a little at a time to incrementally make your developers' lives better.
So when you say running so in my mind, I'm picturing I'm like working at company X, right? Which is like banking, insurance, government, something like that. And I'm building some like internal app, right? Like I need my users they've got widgets to manage, and they go in my app and they manage these widgets. So like, what are some specifics when you say like running it like internal widget app? Like, what are some specifics that this app could look to? Like, because you said modeling open source things. So like running like React or Angular, or those sorts of things. Like, is this things like documentation or
part of it.
Practices?
Yeah. So the first and biggest thing that I think makes the difference is getting rid of what I call golden fences. And I don't know if somebody else may have come up with that term. It's a term I like. I don't remember if I came up with it, but it's golden fences is the idea. And we've all been on engineering teams like this, where this is our code. Nobody else can see it. There's 5 people that can access the repo, and that's the 5 people on my team. We started out right away saying, we don't want that. We want to, just like a public open source, you can go and look at the code. You can fork that repo, you can put a pull request in, and you can contribute whether you're on the core team or not. And so that's the first, and I think in my mind, one of the 2 most important things is developing in the open. Now, in the open in this case is behind your firewall to your people. It's not open to the internet like the public open source projects are, but having the ability, and I blew an SVP's mind one time. I was given a presentation on this, and he says, well, where's your code? And I gave him the link, and I said, and in the README is all the install instructions and how to get, because he was a real engineering SVP. He still wrote code and put apps in the app stores. And 2 or 3 minutes later, 2 or 3 minutes later, he punched the guy next to him, who happened to be our CTO, and he said, hey, he wasn't kidding. I could see all the code. And it was like an epiphany, like nobody else in the company's doing this. So that's one of the things I think is you develop in the open, and then we'll talk about the second thing in a little bit when we get to the culture part.
If I can just feel the audience having a hesitancy of this because they fear bad outcomes, like, have you had bad outcomes, and what sort of culture or processes do you have in place to prevent bad ideas from getting in the system?
I wanted to, if I can add on that real quick, like one of the things that popped in my mind, was there any pushback from, we're a company of 10,000 and we have those 5 engineers. If everyone's looking, 500 people may have a good idea, and we have 500 pull requests to go through. Like, was there any fear that they may get overwhelmed with good intentions, but overwhelming stuff like that?
That did come up, and then the reality is that the rest of the 10,000 people had their own things to do too, so we didn't see that, right? However, we did see a healthy amount of, and because of our collaboration processes and monorepo that we'll get into in a bit, we did see a pretty healthy amount of cross-team, and the monorepo was all of our Angular front-end apps. So everybody in there is looking at Angular code. They're front-end engineers doing Angular, and we had a bunch of cross-team like PR suggestions and even questions, like, hey, why did you choose to do it this way? I can see a potential, and honestly, in a lot of cases, the PR process for us was what you would want it to be. It was a discussion, and it would, in almost all cases, it either made the code better because somebody had an idea of how to do things a little differently that was either more efficient or prevented some bad behavior that wasn't considered, or it made the other engineer better because they learned something.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
It's funny too. It reminds me, my very first sort of task as a professional software developer is I was straight out of college, and I came into an insurance company, and all of their apps, basically every single internal app was IE6 only, just because that's how things worked for forever. And this brand spanking new thing called IE7 came out, and we had to look to make sure all our apps worked in this thing. And I remember my hardest task was actually something you wouldn't expect. It was just tracking down the code of all these internal apps. Like, there was no place where I could go, like, let me search the company's sort of source code, right? Like, because everybody had their own little silos. There were different source control different silos of the company. Yeah. I mean, this is a giant company, right? So there was some proprietary source control. So it sounds like I could see the benefits of that, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in that you could proactively look throughout your org and see, like, this Angular API is something we shouldn't be using anymore. Well, hey, or there's some security vulnerability that came up in React X point Y. Let me just quickly scan around to see what's out there and what I could do about it. Did that sort of thing, does that come up?
It does. And it plays into our monorepo. Now, when you say monorepo, everybody thinks like Google, where they have bloody everything in the company in one repo. Almost no other organizations that have a monorepo have only one repo, right? It's a monorepo for something. And we're the same way. We're 20,000 plus employees, and I don't know how many of them are engineering, but we have people with repos all over the place. And so our monorepo was just for this platform of for building this suite of related apps, right? But inside that, by using the monorepo and using the single dependency model, you can fairly quickly, you don't have to worry about having 5 different versions of some library, right? Because everything has to work on the one version in the monorepo, which is good and bad. It helps when you're upgrading, but if you upgrade something and break something, then it's on you to fix everything that you broke. So,
going back to that 500 people all doing PRs, I think everyone on this call, if I look around, has either led open source or contributed to open source or consumed it. Raise your hand if you had the problem of too many PRs submitted to your code. Like, that doesn't really happen. Maybe the problem is there's too many people wanting their little pet features, but there are rarely too many people trying to shovel coal on the fire.
One of the things we did to kind of head off, we had some pretty strong product people building these things, these applications in the suite, and so they were responsible for roadmaps, and then from the technical side, like for like platform wide stuff, I was kind of the product owner for the types of shared libraries that we needed to put in place for all the apps to be able to use. So I think it can't be just a complete Wild West of everybody just grab it and do whatever. You have to have some governance and some oversight to decide if that good idea is really the best idea for the product or the platform. But we thankfully didn't have any of those issues. We're 3 years into this now. We haven't seen that.
Well, let me see if I got this right. So you have one repository that has some sort of core code, and then there's a bunch of apps that are all related to this, what you call a content pipeline, that use some of these core code pieces, but they're also committed back into the repo. So anyone in this content platform sphere can see each other's code and comment and change and pull and all that. And then not only that, but the rest of the org has access to this as well if they so cared. And then on the side, you have some technical stewards managing the best of the good ideas and sort of discarding the bad ideas. And then there's this sort of democratic process where pull requests are debated on and accepted, rejected, or learned from. Is that where we're at so far?
In a high level. At its peak, we had I think 11 full stack teams, almost totaling around 100 folks pouring code into this monorepo every day. So you can see there's a bunch of pull requests because every engineer is running his or her own branch for a feature or a bug or that they're working on. So there's a lot of branching. We try to PR and merge pretty quickly so that to keep that moving, but there's a lot of code flowing in there. And so each of what we asked our engineers to do is like, hey, a couple times a day when you're at a natural break, take 15 or 20 minutes and just scan through the PRs and look at them and comment on them. And when you get to that kind of scale, one person doesn't have to do every PR review, right? So you can spread that out and really take advantage of the different viewpoints and the different experience levels that each of the engineers that are doing PR reviews can bring.
So I know one thing you mentioned is having a single dependency model. And just so I understand it correctly, that means basically for your sort of monorepo, for the thing that controls all of your app sort of source code, that means you just have like one version of third-party dependencies for like the org, correct?
Yeah, for that entire suite of front-end apps, there was one version of Angular.
So I guess my question is then, how does that not turn into chaos when you need to upgrade things? Just because I know from my experience, when you need to upgrade, say like a major version of Angular, lots of times it's hard to get, say, like business buy-in to say like, oh, we need to retest every single one of our apps for this development change that doesn't actually add any features for our users. So is it something where like when Angular needs to be upgraded, you need to run through like the full QA process to like test everything in the org, or how do you approach, I guess, upgrading in general?
So we put a lot of time into making sure that we had automated unit test suites to start with. And we made a large investment into end-to-end integration testing and making that where we can automate it. So we actually had a team that was responsible. I called them my platform team, and they were responsible for doing things that were not project or not product or app specific. So we had other teams that were assigned to product owners building the app for those product owners, but had this one kind of overarching team that did those generic stuff. And that's one of the things that they did. Every month or so, we would put a few sprint points in or story points in and say, we're going to do dep upgrades and try to keep up. The majority of the time, since we didn't let it get too far behind, it wasn't a big deal.
Is this platform team like dedicated to the platform itself, or were they also doing other stories?
No, they were 100% building features and functions that were able to be used, shared libraries, or working on the kind of centralized admin tool that we have in there, those kinds of things that are taken advantage of by all the other apps. So,
I mean, this could get into some kind of strategy discussion of what does it take to get enough buy-in to run your project like that? Like, was this a topic you had to bring up? Were the executives excited to fund a team that had no direct deliverables? How did you communicate the value of this? It's more of a culture question.
Yeah. So we went probably a year and a half or a year and 3 or 4 months into after we stood this up and we started putting what we called feature teams, these full stack teams that work on things together. We were probably a year and a half into that, and I did kind of a review and went back to my VP and I was like, this is great and all, our product people love having a team that we can dedicate, and when they finish with that app, we can move them over to this other app because our tech stack is standardized. But I've got all this bag of work that I have nobody that's unassigned that we really need to do to benefit the whole thing. And so thankfully, I went through it, and here's what we need to do. Here's the things we need to add to the platform to be able to move it forward and make it even more useful for the apps that are being built into it. And I was fortunate to have a very supportive executive structure that said, fine, go hire a team. I'll find the money for it.
I want to slide this question to Tanner because he's probably the most senior React person on the call here. But one of the benefits we often hear of Angular versus React is in Angular, everything's sort of assembled for you, and in React, you have to go get it. And with this sort of core apps idea, not only have you got all the components of Angular, but you have a lot of components that are unique to apps and your organization also chosen for you, which eliminates a lot of choices and research by development teams. Ideally, they work faster like that. In React, does an idea like this at a larger company hold value where there'd be a caretaker of the extra choices beyond the React library, or are there other ways this is commonly handled?
I definitely say that it depends on the company. Definitely. It's always that it depends, right?
Always.
I feel like either implicitly or explicitly, there's going to be people who are concerned about making these kind of overarching decisions about tools that go throughout an entire React application. Because it's true, there's, things don't come baked in with React. You are kind of designing your own platform, so to speak. So there are more decisions to make, and there's good and bad trade-offs with that. As I'm sure we're all aware of. And, at least in my company, we have a very small team. It's not a large team, but even for our small team, the decisions on what we've chosen to use for, routing and data fetching and every single aspect that you would expect to come with a framework like Angular, it's taken us a long time to refine what that looks like. And there are caretakers of making big decisions about changing things like that. And it's not that they are impossible or that they should be impossible to change. We want to embrace staying up to date. But it does add a different and unique facet to managing a large code base where you're making more decisions like that.
Would you offer some advice or some ideas or strategy for folks that are trying to figure this out on their own? Maybe some blood, sweat, and tears lessons?
Yeah, the one that I always come back to is it's a great mantra that my friend Kent C. Dodds has coined. He calls it AHA programming, and it stands for avoid hasty abstractions. I feel like throughout the last 4 or 5 years of doing React, it was very easy to get into hasty abstractions with React because you are faced with those decisions of how are we going to do these very normal things in React. And it's easy to peg yourself into abstractions that will later bite you in the butt. So
yeah,
I would stick with, do things manually. If it feels like you're repeating yourself, don't worry about it. There's going to be time down the road to figure out what should you use as an entire company for data fetching or routing or whatever. Like there will be time to make those decisions, and don't make that decision too early.
There's a famous computer science rule that says all problems can be solved through abstraction, except the problem of too much abstraction.
Exactly.
It's funny. Dan described like the product team. Tanner, you have like the decision makers. I get this like mental image of like this meeting room at the top of a stairs where like lowly developers have to come up and say like, I present Moments.js. Shall we incorporate it? Like the like yay or nay from the team. Because I sort of have this vision because how like again, like the whole concept of a monorepo still just sort of boggles my mind a little bit, but because I could see there always being disagreements between different teams of like, not only like Angular React, like at that level, but even into like small little decisions of one team finds this UI component they really like to use, or that or like they like more, like perhaps even genuinely solves their problem a little bit better. So is it, in your situation, was it like the platform team that would ultimately like make the call? Do they have to tell other people like, no, you can't use this because of our like single dependency model? We've chosen this and
Right.
we agree this is the path.
That actually was my job. Yeah.
We're talking to the guy in that room up the stairs.
That's right.
That's a pretty good gig.
And we took I only had to really, bring the hammer down on an effort one time. Because we took a pretty open view of that. Like, okay, fine. If you want some sort of grid that's not in here, and you bring the dependency in, then you're responsible for maintaining it and keeping it up. The one time I had to weigh in and say, no, we're not bringing that in, is we had standardized on the material design and Angular material in that grid, and somebody wanted Bootstrap. And I was like, no, you're not bringing Bootstrap in here. Figure out, make yourself learn that the grid system in Angular material, and let's go from there. Because I didn't want that mega massive Bootstrap thing for one use case in the platform.
If I could offer something here, I feel like outside of my small company at Nozzle, dealing with a lot of people in open source, I feel like it's difficult to convince people to use libraries like that when they're so big and they bring so much weight to the table, And I think part of that is manifesting itself in a shift from these massive libraries to much smaller, lighter weight solutions. And I almost feel kind of like what you do, Dan. I think what you do, right? It's kind of mysterious what you do at your company, but I feel like every company that gets big enough is eventually going to have somebody like you that it's not just about making decisions on which tool should we use, but it also becomes a decision of build or buy.
Yes.
If you have 3 or 4 different teams who clearly have well-defined necessities that are justified, and there isn't a tool out there that can satisfy everybody, I think that's a unique opportunity that larger companies have to say, well, okay, we have the manpower and the capability to build something that will make all these teams happy. Do you ever feel like have you ever run into situations like that where you're like, you know what, there just really isn't a choice that will make everybody happy. Let's build our own.
Yes. And there's since become a choice that I wish we had when we started down that path. In our example, we needed the ability to have Angular render a specific set of a form for dozens of different types of content. Either they're promos or music videos or whatever, but every one of those has their own kind of metadata. And well, we didn't want to hand build 37 different forms to enter metadata for all these things, right? So we rolled our own, what we call our dynamic form builder, based on feeding it a couple of JSON schemas and with all of the fields in it and what control types they use and their validations and all that stuff, and then render it and submit it. I've seen since and I forget where it was now, there's an open source library to do essentially the same thing. And I think we put it in place because we had a need, and then it's a shared library in our monorepo now that any app can pull into. And we've got it documented. We got a lot of documentation on how to use it and how to tweak it and do things. But I really wish there had been something that we could have purchased, because that's a pretty big nut to crack on your own when you're in the thick of trying to meet sprint deliverables at the same time.
Yeah, I would say you're not a software developer until you've actually built a dynamic forms generator.
Right.
That's a definite line to cross.
I would love to open source it, but unfortunately that's not possible. Because I think somebody could pick it apart and go, yeah, this is terrible. We should do it this way and maybe make it better. But I can't get it outside the firewall.
That is one of the benefits of open sourcing basically everything you do.
Right. And so to bring it back to the internal open source thing that TJ mentioned, taking that same idea across your engineering org and taking those experience bits, somebody puts up a PR with something and another looks at it. I tried that one time and it killed my performance. Or, it's a kind of contrived example that developer A that did the PR might have not have known. So, and we've seen that in our PR reviews, and they'll get rejected because of this, or comments put on them and said needs work, whatever in the system. And I've watched engineers that of all levels, from juniors to mids to seniors, I've watched them get better because of the collaboration with other engineers through the PR process.
That's an interesting culture piece. The other thing I was thinking of as you're going through all this is if you've got this platform that makes it easy to build apps and you're adding features all the time, it must be a challenge to make sure the developers know what's possible today versus the last time you deployed. So that way they don't go trying to either roll their own or grabbing a new dependency. Like what kind of communications did you have to do to sort of, I don't want to use the word market because I know that's a naughty word, but what did you do to market these capabilities to the developer teams?
So there's a couple of different things, from maybe least effective to most effective. All of our apps and our libraries, we document at least what they're for and the base of how to use them on our Confluence section that we have. I also insist on, especially on the shared libraries, that there be a README in the code base with that same information and more, right? And then what happens by doing that is that comes up into the PR review cycle for all engineers that are looking at those. They'll potentially see those, but some of them could still miss it. And then once a month or so, I put out a newsletter that, as much for my engineering staff to say, hey, the build process got upgraded. Here's what we're doing now. Or there's this new tool that we've introduced that you can take advantage of. And we've scheduled some time. Like we brought feature flagging system in, and we've scheduled some time with the company that provides that, and those kinds of things for the engineering level. But then also from the internal marketing perspective of sending that up the chain, so that the executives know, hey, here's what our money is getting us from this platform team, or from one of the other teams has built this really nice thing that we've extracted into a shared library so that it can be used by all of them. I think probably the most effective for the engineers are the READMEs, because they've kind of been conditioned to say, before you decide you need something, go look through the libs folder and see if there's something there. And those READMEs in each of the libraries in the libs folder are critical for that part. From the executive side, the newsletter has been the biggest thing for them.
So you have some responsibility to kind of operate the ecosystem. And then part of that is creating a developer habit that this is your catalog of things. And then there's also some effort put into broadcasting the value that the company is buying for their investment. Is that what you basically said?
Right. And to tie on to that, one of the things that I have stressed to them all the time is like, if you think that there's something that should be a shared library, build it and let's discuss it and refine it. Because if you have the need for a particular set of functionality, chances are another app in the suite is going to need that at some point if they don't already. So let's all, rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing here. Put it over there. Somebody else will put something in there that you may need, and let's literally all row in the same direction to continue the maritime examples.
Yeah. So this kind of colors in the, if you imagine that room with the stairs where all the great decisions are being made, it sounds like it's not really up the stairs. Like you're open to the ideas from the staff, and they're willing and they're enabled and empowered to have good ideas and act on them.
Yes.
But there's still some sort of overarching is the word guidance I'm looking for, where you're making sure that things don't stray too far from the ideal.
Yeah, and that's kind of my job, the oversight piece, because I told the teams, I was like, look, my job is a large percentage of removing friction so you can do your job. So if something's bothering you, let me know and I'll go see if I can take care of it, or I'll kick it upstairs to somebody that can take care of it. I said, but then another part of my job is to set what my VP used to refer to as the guardrails on this journey we're on, and let you operate between them, but not set them so wide that we shoot ourselves in the foot, and not set them so narrow that, everybody's mad because they can't use their thing or whatever. So that's a challenge on my perspective, is to, and it changes over time. Those guardrails kind of move a little bit as we iterate and we move forward. We have, I have biweeklies that with me and each of the teams where they can raise issues. Hey, this is really causing us a problem. Great. Let's look at it and see what we can do with it. And that worked out very well, because we had a lot of good ideas surfaced that way, or pain points that were surfaced that way that I wasn't aware of. And it really was a joy to work with these people throughout that process.
Nice. Ray, you work for a pretty complex company. What are do you have any thoughts here you haven't been able to get in?
So we're definitely a bit, and I'm trying to make sure I don't say too much. We
do secretive stuff here, like people working for like the Defense Department or something. Like,
I got my NSA
processes here.
It's like what Dan is talking about sounds awesome, and we're not there yet. So,
yeah.
So I love my company, but we're definitely not at that scale yet, where we have that kind of internal collaboration going on. It would definitely be nice to see. I think it'd be helpful. But yeah, we're not there yet.
Just to refine my point here, is it possible, without drifting into areas that you don't want to talk about, but are there organizational blockers to this that you can identify that might help listeners understand where they might have trouble trying to roll something like this out? Or is this just in another part of the org and you don't really hang out over there, kind of thing? And I'm just giving you an easy out if this isn't the topic you want to pursue.
So yeah, I like, in terms of like our APIs and stuff, like I have no idea how they're built. They could be built on Cold Fusion. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. But like my concern comes in when it comes to the documentation of those APIs, when it comes to how they're exposing new features and stuff, how it's actually built, the source code behind it doesn't ever enter my domain. I assume that they are building it with the best technology and tools available, but I'm not involved in the actual building of those APIs. I just want to make sure that our users can actually use them.
So you've got your sphere of responsibility, and it doesn't necessarily overlap with the builders of the APIs and the product.
I mean, outside of, that they say that they're going to add cowbell to an API, I could care less what library is behind that or what's code. It's how do I, as a developer, how do I ring that cowbell? What's the documentation plan for that cowbell? And what noise is it going to make? What's the output, essentially? And is that ideal for my customers, I guess, which is my developers? Is it ideal for their needs? Because to me, they are far more important than what you may think. I'm actually with the people who are using it day to day.
Right. So I want to toss this to Raymond and also Tanner, but as open source stewards, and one of the goals of this show is to sort of bring open source ideas into organizations. Like, what have you seen in your own open source projects that you've either led or contributed to that make for more effective collaboration or moving the project forward, or ideas you think could have a place in an organization? Ray, if you want to start with that one, we'll go to Tanner next.
Yeah, because it's one word: documentation.
Boo, boo. There's supposed to be a magic bullet somewhere.
Drop the mic. And
that is a magic bullet because people are afraid of it. I got into a somewhat heated argument on a Slack channel recently because I criticized an open source project for saying that they released a feature but didn't document it. And I'm like, well, you didn't release a feature, period. And I got smacked down for that because it's open source, all volunteer. It's
Blah, blah, blah. Right.
I'm like, I don't care. Like, if you actually want someone to use it, if that's your intent, you want someone to use your product, whether you're a volunteer or not, if you don't document it, they're not going to use it. And you don't get to use that as an excuse of, oh, it's open source. Why don't you just write it yourself? Like,
Yeah. Here's my lazy card, open source.
yeah.
We used to say on the native script project that the docs are the product, because you can build the greatest stuff in the world, and if people don't know it's there or can't use it effectively, is it really there? Like, philosophically, not really.
It's funny too, because talking, Ray, about like internal stuff as well, because for the stuff at Progress, because most of what we're building is public, like documentation is a part of our process. So whether the docs are good or not is debatable, but at least we usually put effort into it. But when it comes to internal stuff, the docs are an afterthought at best, right? So like if it's public facing, at least it's on a checklist of somebody to go through and at least consider. But if it's something that's just for internal people to use, like God knows what you're going to find when you end up in that repo, right? Like you might need some internal dependency that you can only get on a network drive that you have to be on some VPN to get, which is a real thing I ran into this week, right? And then you have to find somebody on Slack that's like, oh God, what is this dependency? Where is it? How do I get it? It's on this drive. No, I can't get the, you go through all these processes. So I think like my biggest takeaway is I really like the idea of treating internal stuff like you would anything that you would put out sort of in a public repo, because I can say for Progress, at least, as well as every other organization I've worked for, like I said, it doesn't get treated that way. It's just chaos at best.
Yeah, Tanner, just to toss the question your way. The question was, as an open source author and contributor, what have you seen in your open source ecosystems that you think companies could be taking advantage of, either as a philosophy or a practice or a habit or something like that?
Well, something that I feel very strongly about as an open source developer is there is a very strong intrinsic drive for you to do a good job if you want people to use your stuff. And I heard comments about throwing lazy cards around and, that it's just open source, so it's an easy way out. And I think what it really means is that it's different for every different person. There are open source people who don't want anybody to use their tools. They just do it because they can, right?
For the lulz.
And what it comes down to is it's survival of the best tool, right? The great thing about open source is that if somebody releases a feature and they don't document it, well, you don't have to use that library. You can just go to the next library that will release features that are documented, and that's a great like open market concept. And
yeah,
I think that drives a lot of good habits in the open source ecosystem, is that if I want people to use my library, I need to treat it like a business. In fact, I remember writing a small article about this a year or two ago, where if you treat your open source projects like a business, they will be successful. And it's because you need to market. I hate, everybody hates that word, but you need to market, and you need to think of your users as customers, and their loyalty is not something that you can just throw around. And all of that intrinsic drive that I think a good open source developer has, I think all of those habits are very valuable if you can bring them into a business. Like, I would even say that if somebody in the company has a library that they're like, look, I added this package, it's really cool, you should use it. Oh, but it doesn't have any documentation, right? As a decision maker at a high level, if somebody comes to me and says, I don't want to use this package, and I'm like, well, why? Well, it doesn't have documentation and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that's a valid point. In that case, I'd say, yeah, go find something better. And to this person that created the package and wants it to be adopted within the company, I'm going to say, you better go write some docs, or so-and-so team and the other team, they're going to go find a different tool. Like, that's the real world. That's what happens in open source. And I think if it happens in a business, what could happen other than making better tools available, you know?
That's a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, we had a comment in the chat from Ben Bash Official. It says, reminds me of the early days of the Webpack docs. So powerful, but really hard to get started with. And to me, at least, if I remember back to Webpack, I feel like it started to get popular when like Sean Larkin got involved and like actually started putting some docs and some good material around actually using it, because it had existed for quite a few years. But if nobody knows how to do it, like unless you just someone happens to find it and tinker with it, which I mean, I guess it theoretically could happen, but docs are everything.
You know, as Tanner was talking, it reminded me, I headed up a MVC framework called Model Glue for a while, and it was a good framework. It was very, very effective to use, and we had docs and we had repos and we had videos and tutorials, and I wrote a course and I'd call it a book because it's actually printed out in book form, but it's like maybe 100 pages. So it's not as cool as TJ's book, and it's not as cool as Ray's book, but it was a book.
Ray's books, right? How many?
Yeah. More than it's a non-zero number, right, Ray? So anyway, this new framework came around called Coldbox, which had many of the same ideas as the Model Glue framework, but their documentation was amazing and beautiful. And the guy that ran it was a great guy, and I considered him to be a competitor and a collaborator and a friend. And so, you know, that's one thing I liked about open source is I'm really not, you know, these people I'm working with and against. It's sort of a broad team anyway, but they kicked the snot out of us just because their docs were so amazing. And I watched that happen. And then, you know, congratulations, Luis. You did a better job than me on that. And I admire his efforts and foresight to put that much effort in docs. The reason why developers hate docs is A, they're not that much fun to write. And B, the minute you ship a cool feature, the docs are out of date. And they can always be out of date. The code can't be out of date, but the docs can drift out of date.
Yeah, let's dig into that, because actually I think it's so easy to complain about docs. But Dan, do you have any suggestions about how to get people to write docs? Because if that's the book you need to write, if you found a solution to get people to document their work, I think you've got the $1 million idea right there.
Totally.
In our case, with our monorepo setup and our engineering teams, like each of the engineers doing the pull request would keep the other, like hold the other engineer's feet to the fire, and would, you know, they weren't shy about marking it needs work if it wasn't documented well. And so I think that rolls back into your culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that this is a thing that it kind of starts from top down, right? Because I'm pushing it and trying to get it to be it's something that we think front of mind to, again, remove friction from the next developer that wants to use that particular library or whatever. So it's a little bit top down to start with, but I think if you do it well and it gets like the grassroots and everybody just starts operating that way and helping each other continue to operate that way, for us at least, it wasn't a struggle. You know, sometimes I'd go tripping through the repo and go, oh, somebody forgot to fill out the README on this one, and I'd have to, you know, raise the flag that one got missed or whatever. But for the most point, you know, you ship an update to a library or a new library or something, your PR reviewers, they needs work, the README is not fleshed out, you know, that kind of stuff. So it kind of takes a village at some point, I think.
So there's some sense of this is what we do here, and then there's like social pressure amongst other people to ensure that they conform to what we do here.
Yeah, in my head, knowing now that Dan is like the leader of all these decisions, to continue our metaphor at the top of the stairs, Dan is sitting there. He's got a throne, right? He's got the crown and like a scepter. Yeah, exactly. And if someone sends a PR without documentation, Dan just like pounds his scepter down and it gets carted off until they go write documentation in this.
Yeah, and you know, we make fun of it. It obviously wasn't to that level because, again, I had amazing teams of super professionals working in this thing.
The good staff helps.
Yeah, it really does, right? And I understand that we were very blessed to have that situation.
We're coming up on, probably have about 10-ish minutes left. Might be good to kind of get some final thoughts from the crew. Tanner, you've had some pretty great insights so far. So let's put you on the spot again and turn the crank. Dispense some wisdom, sir. If you're going to give any advice to organizations that want to be better in their culture and in their open source practices internally, what would you say at this point where we're at in the discussion?
Uh-oh.
He's very still.
Either he's very still.
He's thinking very hard about this.
Or we have a Tanner down. All right, we'll come back to him. We all know the internet can be flaky. Ray, what thoughts or ideas do you have?
Anything that removes friction from allowing people to help. GitHub, for example, has made documentation updates super easy, where if you don't know Git CLI very well and you don't necessarily know how to make a fork and make a pull request and all that, a lot of sites will have, click here to edit this doc. It takes you right to the repo. It's very direct with a little pencil icon. You write, GitHub forks it for you. You save that file, and it holds your hand through the whole process. And even though I've been using Git for 5 or 6 years, I'm a very casual user, and GitHub just making that stupid easy for me helps.
Mm-hmm.
So try to identify the things that are a friction for people and remove them. Obviously, don't just find them.
No, just identify them and keep them there. They're job security. Hey, Tanner.
Hey, sorry, Xfinity is working in my neighborhood today, so I won the lottery.
There you go. So we, it was an inopportune moment because I was basically asking if you had, I was turning the crank and getting some more Tanner wisdom about companies being better at open source and the culture internally. So putting you on the spot here, like what would you share at this point of the conversation to help companies be better or aspire to be better?
I think not only allowing but encouraging employees to participate in open source, even if it's outside of your company's culture of treating everything as open source internally is great. But there are experiences and skills that you learn working with people from all over the world doing open source that you just cannot get in other places. I have worked with so many different people who have been fantastic and extremely difficult, and have submitted amazing PRs and been very annoying. People who have tried to bring down my brand of open source and call me a bad developer, or people who have praised my work, right? It's just the spectrum is so much greater when your work is public or when you're contributing in a public sphere. And I love working with great open source developers because they're diplomatic, they're courteous, they know how to resolve conflicts, not just literally, but in terms of having disagreements. And sometimes you don't get that with employees. And sometimes I found myself wishing that, man, I wish I was building my business with these guys I know on open source. We could build a great product together.
So as like kind of a part B here, like, you run some open source products and libraries, like what in your mind makes a great contributor? What are you looking for? How can they be a good contributor to a project that they like?
I think Xfinity just took out Tanner again.
Xfinity
came back to his area.
Wow. It got him at a good smile.
Yeah.
Keep him there. Skaggs, I think it's fair to say that during this process, you've optimized your organization for efficiency of building apps.
Sorry,
is there anything? You Xfinity'd again.
Oh, God.
So the question was, what are you looking for in a good open source contributor to one of your projects? Like what behaviors or attributes do you like to see when people are wanting to help?
I'm looking.
Oh my God. Wow. I have to say, Dan, I'm going to start using Xfinity as a verb from now on. I'm totally down for that. Like what happened to Xfinity?
I just got a Slack message from the cabal of closed source saying they're capping Tanner's feet on purpose.
Yeah.
He's being too helpful.
Yeah.
This is ridiculous. Can you guys see me?
Yeah. You're back.
We can see you right now. Yeah.
All right. I'll be really quick then. Communication. Communication is what I'm looking for, because you have to be able to communicate issues well, how to reproduce them. You have to communicate your expectations, and then ultimately you have to communicate how you expect it to work in code. So people who don't know how to communicate well will not survive in open source. So that's what I'm looking for.
And
Excellent.
I think to tag onto that, you have to be able to know how to deal with people that don't know how to communicate well when they're, you absolutely can't let a PR comment keep you up at night.
No, you have to learn to help other people help themselves. And I've seen trends in how to do that in open source, I got to just say this first thing came to my mind, code sandbox. If you're a React or Angular developer, I'm like, make a code sandbox. Show me an example. Like the ability for these developers to replicate something and be able to discuss it in a form that everybody can get on the same page.
Yeah.
These online editors like Code Sandbox and environments where everybody can kind of be like, well, you're not in your code and I'm not in my code. We're in a shared space here. That has been so key in communication, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point.
I think another thing around communication too, especially when I've worked in open source, is you have to be not afraid to ask things as well. Like, because lots of times this gets into Dan's golden fences thing earlier. Sometimes you view certain areas of an open source project or internal as like this person's special area, but those fences aren't going to be broke down until somebody starts asking questions. How does this work? How do I get in here? So don't view certain areas of the code base as sacred or certain things or as things that you can't touch. If you want to help, usually I found in open source, if you're willing to do work, people will be happy to help you do that, right? If you're saying, I want to come in and make this better, that's going to get a much better response than if you're just asking like a general support question. Like if you
Absolutely.
say, my code doesn't work for this reason, people are busy. But if you say, I'm having this problem and I want to fix it, you're opening that conversation in a far different way.
Yeah. I think a good indicator of successful open source projects is definitely community and how these situations are handled. Look at any successful open source project and they've figured it out. And I think that's something we could definitely bring into our companies.
Yep. And, on the topic of golden fences, there's this really great book, and it's actually aged pretty well, called The Phoenix Project. I don't know if you guys ever read that one. It's a phenomenal book. Skaggs read it 3 times. I read it twice. What it's about is it kind of makes the case for repeatable operations in software development, but it does it in novel form. And there's a guy in there named Brent who is the epitome of a golden fence, so to speak. He's the only guy that can make anything work and doesn't know how he does it. He just sits at the keyboard and like duct tapes his way into getting everything back and running. And this book really outlines why that is a bad idea. And I think if you have a spot where you have golden fences, either you've given someone a meal ticket or you've created an island of risk for your company if something happens to that team. Maybe they hit the gas station on the way home and scratch off a ticket and, hey, they're not coming to work tomorrow because they're rich. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to interpret stuff and things that make the company around that no one understands? That's, we've progressed as an industry in the last 20, 30 years beyond that point, but I think other folks maybe haven't caught up, and there are these pockets of controlled wisdom in companies, and it's kind of a bad thing for all the reasons we've mentioned on this broadcast. I know we're kind of wrapping up here. TJ, you have any extra points to bring up?
I just want to toss it over to Dan to any last points you want to wrap us up with, anything we haven't covered at this point, or any like parting words on the topic.
One parting thought coming from the person that was charged with setting this up and overseeing it for the last 3 years and growing it. Listen to your folks, like hire good people and trust them that they want to do good things for the project, and be open to hearing things. It makes I know from my experience, from my level up, it makes a huge difference to know that the person above you trusts what you say and what you're recommending. But I think it works the other way too. If you're leading this kind of an org, trust the people that you discuss things. You don't just take their word blindly, but trust that they have the best intentions and work through it and let them help them be successful, because it will make you successful.
It's a good note to end on. So I want to go around roundtable one more time. If people have just anything they want to plug, or where to follow up, basically Twitter handles and such, if you want to give the opportunity to drop it. I'll start. My name's TJ VanToll on Twitter. If you found this stream interesting, you can subscribe on Twitch. You can follow us on Twitch and you'll get notified when we have these episodes. React Wednesdays, every Wednesday, 1 o'clock Eastern. Dan, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Dan Wilson, at Dan Wilson on Twitter. It is the only thing I've ever gotten Dan Wilson at, ever. Please name your kids something unique, people. I'm going to write this show up. There's a lot of great parts and post it on the Digital Primates blog. And if you're interested in React content, we do curate the Enterprise React newsletter. If you Google that, you'll find us. And we promise we'll take really good care of your email.
Ray?
I'm at Raymond Camden on Twitter, and my DMs are open. I'd love to get questions. So if there's anything I could help you with, reach out.
And Dan, you want to? I think we lost. Tanner got Xfinity again, so I'll drop his Twitter handle in the chat. And Dan, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I'm at Skaggs on Twitter, and I'll make a little bit of a shameless plug for my own blog, danskaggs.com. I've just started a series diving a little bit deeper into this whole notion. So over the next few weeks, we'll be fleshing out that series and looking at individually a little bit deeper some of the points that we talked about today.
Cool.
So we can do Tanner's plug. Tanner is a very prolific open source library creator and maintainer, and an excellent React developer, and gives React talks and presentations at really cool conferences around the world. He's a super nice guy, and his Twitter is...
Hi, you're putting me on the spot. I haven't gotten it yet. I was getting an Xfinity joke ready. I was going to say like his.
It's at Tanner Linsley, Linsley.
And you got to tell me when you're setting me up for this. I didn't get the obvious softball coming. Don't let your kids use don't let your kids use Xfinity. I was going to say Sitefinity. That was a bad joke.
You almost got fired.
I can't go there.
Before we ring out,
Sitefinity is a good CMS, man.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Before we ring out, shout out to a user in the chat, the Sirax856, mentioned that he's 13 and doing Python. So keep at it. It's fun. It's an awesome career. Hats off to jumping into it at 13.
Exactly. Right on.
Way cooler than what I was doing at 13. You're way ahead of the curve. All right. Thanks, guys. This is an awesome chat. I really appreciate you taking the time. And till next time, everyone.